Hello and welcome to The Royals, the podcast where we tell you what's really happening behind palace walls and why it matters.
And this week, those palace walls have been breached by a historic data dump of mega proportions. We've seen more than 3 million pages of evidence released from US Congress in relation to the investigation over sex offender Jeffrey Epstein.
The fallout has been immense. It triggered a significant intervention from the Prime Minister, who issued a direct demand to Andrew. He said, "Testify to US Congress or you'll be failing victims."
It's a crisis that refuses to go away. We've seen documents in which Andrew appears to invite Jeffrey Epstein for dinner at Buckingham Palace just weeks after he was released from house arrest for sex offences.
And the shockwaves aren't limited to the royal family, with Peter Mandelson facing a possible police investigation over his relationship to Epstein. We have to ask, just how deep do these establishment links go?
And what do these documents reveal about Andrew's relationship with Epstein? To answer all these questions, we're pleased to be joined by Caroline Wheeler, the political editor of The Sunday Times and co-host of the Times podcast, The State of It. Welcome, Caroline.
Thank you.
Now, Caroline, before we get into this week's news, which there is a lot of, it's worth noting just how unusual it is to hear the monarchy being discussed so frankly by politicians and in government briefings. So what has been the feeling around Westminster following this scandal and the latest tranche of documents that we saw released on Friday night?
Well, I think it had been quite a difficult period of government when they didn't talk about the royal family, particularly in the wake of earlier revelations about Jeffrey Epstein and his relationship with Lord Mandelson and obviously the scandal engulfing the royal family. But that is because, by precedent, politicians shouldn't talk about the royal family, particularly not on the floor of the House. And in fact, there are very arcane sort of rules and regulations known as Erskine May, which say that MPs can't criticise or can't even really mention the royal family at all. However, since Andrew was stripped of his titles, it's understood that those rules have now changed, that MPs are now free to criticise him in particular in the chamber. But even more broadly than that, that convention has been adopted by ministers and prime ministers, even outside the chamber. So it's very rare for them to intervene at all in matters of the royal family. So I think that it's both been refreshing because I think MPs are quite pleased now that there has been this opportunity for parliamentarians to comment on this, because I think there was a sense that it was letting victims down, that the royal family was not a subject, and this particular scandal was not a subject that was being discussed in the kind of political circles. But of course, the ramifications of it for the government and the ministers because of the Mandelson connection are incredibly embarrassing, and people are rightly furious about all of this because of the appointment in the first place.
That's really interesting hearing you talk about it's understood there's been a change in convention, that it hasn't been sort of formalised. Your feeling in Westminster since all this started to break again towards the end of last year in the autumn, do you feel MPs and politicians and government and opposition have been emboldened by it, emboldened to criticise and question the royal family?
Yes, certainly with the Prime Minister. I don't think we'd have seen an answer by the Prime Minister in the terms that we did on Saturday. I was with the Prime Minister.
Well, you were coming back from China, weren't you?
Yeah.
And was that where that conversation took place?
It was. So we flew with the Prime Minister to Beijing last Tuesday, and we stayed in Beijing for a few days and then went to Shanghai and then had a very brief stopover in Tokyo on the way home. So we had what's known as a huddle, which happens during these trips where journalists get a kind of an opportunity to question the Prime Minister. It's usually on the trips themselves, but you can talk about anything that you want to ask him about. And particularly because we were on our way home, we realised that the attention was going to be on domestic affairs. And obviously, it had been hard to ignore the fact that the Jeffrey Epstein files had kind of broken, that they were all over the news. It was obviously going to be a topic of great interest and discussion. So he hosted one of these huddles by the toilet in the plane. But he was asked about a number of things, and obviously Epstein came up. And he said very, very forthright, in a very forthright way, that he thought that Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor should testify, and said that that was because Epstein's victim should be the number one priority. So effectively saying that if Andrew did not give evidence, he was going to be letting down victims. Now, I've never heard a Prime Minister speak about the royal family in those terms before, and I've been covering the political beat for the last 23 years. And so I do think that this particular change in circumstances, particularly for Andrew, has meant that there is a bit more freedom for them to cover these particular subject areas.
Well, his comments made me think that because the Prime Minister had come out and said that to you on the plane, there had been a shift within the palace as well. Because all of a sudden it became, to me, speaking to palace insiders, that there was a shift, that they were saying, well, the king can't compel Andrew to testify to US Congress, but it is very much a matter for his conscience. So the idea being the king wouldn't stand in his way, and although he can't force him to, he seemed to be certainly through people in and around the palace backing up that idea. The ball's now in Andrew's court to inspect his conscience.
There's been a kind of a general shifting of position, because obviously when there was the conversations that were going on about stripping
Titles.
Andrew of the titles,
it seemed to bounce backwards and forwards.
Exactly.
The palace kept saying it's a matter for government. Government kept saying we need to work in lockstep with the palace, and no one really wanted to grip it.
But it was
and then they finally did.
Yeah, and it was quite interesting because there was lots of chatter at that time about who was actually going to move, because it had to be a substantive motion. And this is another massively arcane sort of protocol in Westminster, that in order to talk about the royal family in any terms whatsoever, it had to be done as a substantive motion. So it was then a question of who was going to bring the substantive motion. At one point, it looked like the Liberal Democrats were going to bring a substantive motion, but they were just equally as nervous as the government of doing that, because they wanted to make sure that they weren't acting against the wishes of the palace. And of course, as Royal, we've discussed many times, the way in which these discussions are had are in this incredible sort of system known as the Golden Triangle.
Who are?
It's the Cabinet Secretary,
The Cabinet Secretary,
the Principal Private Secretary to the Prime Minister,
and the Principal
and
Private
the
Secretary
King's
to the King.
Private
Yeah,
Secretary.
Yes,
Yay.
who are in almost daily contact at the best of times, and in the worst of times, I would say probably in contact with each other several times an hour around what we were seeing before Christmas with the stripping of the titles. Let's just remind ourselves a little bit of why you had that huddle as well with Keir Starmer on the plane, because what we saw on Friday night as you were flying with him was this enormous dump from Congress, what they say is going to be the last release of files. I think that's debatable. We can come on to that. Of 3 million pages worth of documents, 180,000 images, 2,000 videos which were posted publicly, which journalists here and around the world are still poring over. Huge amount of email correspondence, a lot from Jeffrey Epstein's estate, a lot more correspondence between Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, the former Prince Andrew, Sarah Ferguson, we'll come on to that. But Keir Starmer, who you were with, has a huge skin in the game here as well, not just making pronouncements about Andrew, of course, but because of Peter Mandelson. Tell us what is going on there, because of course last year Peter Mandelson lost his job as US ambassador because of his links. It's gone much further. How dangerous is it for Mandelson, and how dangerous is it for the government?
Well, the really interesting thing about the conversation we had with the Prime Minister on the plane was we didn't just ask him about Andrew, we also asked him about Lord Mandelson, because it was already coming to light that money had been exchanged, that there were bigger questions to be asked once again about Peter Mandelson and his relationship.
These are 3 bank statements which appear to show that Epstein paid $75,000 into accounts connected to Mandelson between 2003 and 2004.
Correct.
And that also Mandelson's now husband had received money from Epstein as well.
For his course, that's right. And so we asked about Peter Mandelson and what he thought about the latest revelations. He didn't want to go there at all. He said he'd said everything that he had to say about Peter Mandelson, which I think in hindsight now...
How times have changed in 48, 72 hours
and
since
also
then.
potentially, quite a naive response on the basis that, it was evident that there were millions of documents that people were going to take time going through, that it was inevitable, I think, that there was going to be more revelations about Lord Mandelson, as indeed there have been. And the fact that he was going to get away with not saying anything further is sort of symptomatic of, I think, one of the problems we've seen time and time again with this government is that they are very flat-footed when it comes to crises. They tend to kind of want some thinking time. They don't act quickly. This is indeed what happened when the original sort of emails started to break about Peter Mandelson before he was fired.
Which was just before the US state visit with Donald Trump coming here.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
I mean, these are truly shocking emails. If you're in our world, it's very, very rare that people would get away with sending such sensitive and personal information, which we don't see very often in government. So,
well, it's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, we keep talking about these documents and saying appears to, seems to, because, the US Congress have said they haven't verified whether these are legitimate documents. They're just part of the investigation into Jeffrey Epstein and his associates. Mandelson says he can't remember receiving any payment from Epstein, although it does seem clear that he's acknowledged that some money was given to his husband to further his education. But it's also embarrassing as well. We see a picture of Peter Mandelson in his underwear.
No, it's incredibly embarrassing. And I think, at the heart of the matter, it comes down to why on earth was this individual appointed in the first place.
Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor is under huge pressure from the nation and from our Prime Minister to testify.
But you're right that there's pressure mounting, isn't there? Like we've heard today as well from Prince Edward, who's now come out and been the first member of the royal family to speak about the Epstein files since the latest tranche dropped on Friday. And he's urged that we should remember the victims in this. He said there are a lot of victims and that we should remember them. He was speaking during a visit to UAE in which he was asked, as members of the royal family are going to be asked about these sorts of things around Epstein. Lord Mandelson is to step down from the House of Lords. It's been announced by the Lord Speaker. Tell us what that means. What are the ramifications for that, Caroline?
Can he step down?
No, he can't, actually.
Okay.
No, he can't.
Tell us why.
So, I mean, I think that's what the government had been hoping he would do, because it will take some of the pressure off in terms of them acting.
But does it technically remove his peerage?
And just so you know what that means, like, for example, as journalists at the Times and the Sunday Times, we always refer to people by their full title. So he would be known as Lord Mandelson until that title is removed, which has to be done by Act of Parliament. And as far as I'm aware, it's only ever happened once before, which is in 1919, when some minor members of the aristocracy were basically stripped of their titles by an Act of Parliament because they were German sympathisers during the sort of the war period.
It's reminding us both of the fudge by Buckingham Palace first time round. In October, a statement issued by Prince Andrew, as he was then, by the palace, saying that the titles were no longer going to be used. And the briefing from the palace at the time was they were going to go into abeyance, but he would still retain them.
Because relinquishing a dukedom is so complicated that actually his family does still retain that kind of House of York title. So it means his daughters, Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie, can still use that title.
But it did not go down well,
a week
did it?
Later, we had a Buckingham Palace spokesman saying that the King has started a formal process to strip him of those titles. So that meant that we can't refer to him as Duke of York. He can't just leave them, in the back cupboard and bring them out, at a future occasion. He would never be able to use them. This sounds very similar. That the times and the world that we're living in now, and the way that people are reacting to these big stories is actually kind of changing the way we deal with those past and those historic.
I think that's
rules,
right.
If you
but
like.
I also think that we're again in this situation where I don't think the government quite knows what to do, and it's waiting for this kind of thinking time. It was said in Cabinet this morning that they would draw up legislation to strip him of his titles, but there was a kind of slight caveat to that. They were looking into how they would potentially do it. And I think there has definitely been a sense from the people that I've been talking to that they are reticent to do certain things because they know that if you introduce legislation, it's always open to amendment. You could end up with kind of unintended consequences of introducing legislation, which then leads to the kind of de-lauding of other people that potentially have done things that maybe they shouldn't have done. And I think that they're just really conscious that they don't want to open a kind of Pandora's box. But this again speaks to, I think, one of the problems this government has is it's not quick-footed at all. And it always wants to buy itself kind of a bit of breathing space. And then what happens is the pressure builds up, the kind of damage of delay is then compounded by the fact that they always end up doing what the public want them to do or what they're being pushed to do.
But just too late to make it seem bold.
Exactly.
But bringing us back to Epstein, I think it's something that it shows. We're talking about the royal family. You're talking about, a peer of the realm. And this is somebody, a convicted paedophile, who's managed to infiltrate both of our worlds in a most extraordinary way.
Let's get back to some of the why we're talking about Keir Starmer, Mandelson and Andrew again, because what we learned from that dump of files on Friday night, and we are still learning almost on an hourly basis, some of the kind of key things that seemed quite shocking at the time, and they still do now. We should add, before we get into this, that Andrew has always denied any allegations of wrongdoing, and just being named and seen in photos and documents and emails in the files doesn't mean, doesn't suggest wrongdoing related to Jeffrey Epstein. But there were some quite stark images that came out and quite stark revelations. So we saw all these photos come out. Of course, they're undated, they're uncaptioned. We have no context for them, but they appear to show Andrew kneeling over a woman, looking at the camera in a setting that appears to be Jeffrey Epstein's Manhattan townhouse. Crouched over a woman on the floor, bending over her. We don't know who she is. We don't know the scenario. Barefooted Andrew. We saw correspondence between Andrew and Epstein, with Andrew inviting him for dinner at Buckingham Palace very soon after he had served a year of probation for child prostitution. There was a lot that came out in the files on Friday and Saturday that went completely against Andrew's version of events in that Newsnight interview, and it has just opened the floodgates, hasn't it?
Yeah, it shows the element of the correspondence between Andrew and Epstein, and Andrew and Ghislaine Maxwell, who he's claimed never to be that close with. And she said that she was his best friend. She said that she couldn't wait to see him and be in his arms again, literally. But also financial affairs as well, as we talked about with Mandelson.
What was your reaction when you saw some of that stuff, Caroline? I mean, I know, you're operating in the political world, we're operating in the royal world. They're colliding at the moment.
Yeah,
when you saw some of that detail, what
just utterly unbelievable. I mean, I genuinely don't have the adjectives to describe it. I mean, to see it's very similar in our world as well, just to say, because actually what's come out really contradicts all of the information that Peter Mandelson has given us about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Very much, talking about him as his best pal. He's known as PT. The fact that messages get sent to him within sometimes minutes of him receiving a message from Downing Street, it's being pinged onto Jeffrey. The relationship is clearly much, much closer, I think, than any of us were led to believe.
This is a problem for the institution, isn't it? I think you've got, the British institution being infiltrated, essentially, not by, a Chinese spy or some sort of undercover state operator, but somebody operating in plain sight, who had pleaded guilty to sex offences, who had served time for sex offences, and still was managing to spread tentacles within the elite here.
And I don't know if it's the same in your world, but what we're kind of wondering is how it sort of snowballs now, because obviously Lord Mandelson wasn't just an appointee of this particular government doing that job in Washington. Lord Mandelson was absolutely intrinsic to the entire operation of the Labour Party. He spent 4 decades working at the heart of the Labour Party. He has been at the heart of Sir Keir Starmer's renaissance as Labour leader. He's very friendly with most members of the cabinet, including, of course, the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, and the Business Secretary, Peter Kyle, who were, very much involved in Labour Together, an organisation that he was, very much part of in terms of creating the new sort of Starmer administration. And it just feels like the tentacles of this they're just going everywhere. I mean, including the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, who is also Morgan McSweeney, is also known to be incredibly close to Peter Mandelson. So it just has the sense that this isn't going to stop here, that the revelations are going to keep coming, but also the relationships between so many members of the government, and I imagine the same with other members of the royal family, are going to come under scrutiny.
But it's not just Andrew that they're very, very difficult headlines have come out of some of the lurid details. It's also Sarah Ferguson, his wife, his daughters as well, their daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, because we saw emails in July 2009 which appeared to show Sarah Ferguson arranging to have lunch in Palm Beach with Epstein and Beatrice and Eugenie.
And flight details as well. So we see Sarah appearing to email Jeffrey Epstein to talk to him about getting flights sent over.
And
Epstein's assistant sort of says, will Sarah be flying business class or first class? And Epstein just replies, biz.
But that lunch, if it happened, which we just mentioned there, would have been 5 days after his release from a Florida jail. 5 days.
So you have to think, why would Sarah Ferguson take her 2 young daughters to go and stay with a convicted sex offender who who has been convicted of sex offences with young women. Why would you take those two young princesses over there to do
And
that?
why would they go?
Not only
20
that,
and 19. Old enough, you would think, to be able to make a decision.
Also, the palace, I think, has questions to answer. We see in the documents what appears to be Amanda Thirsk, then Prince Andrew's private secretary, emailing to say, can a couple of Andrew's bodyguards come to stay? Now, they were paid up members of the Metropolitan Police Force who were paid to protect Andrew from taxpayers' money, who were then going over, it seems, to stay at Epstein's largesse. Now, it's unclear whether the offer of accommodation was accepted. Do you think now the government will be compelled to release more information, be more transparent, like our friends across the Atlantic in America?
I think they will have to be, because I think that their hand is almost being forced, because they now don't know what is out there. I mean, there are, as you have rightly said, there are millions of documents. It could take weeks for everybody to get through and understand, because they are highly redacted. It sometimes takes, quite a lot to kind of, look at and understand what this information means. And I think that, they are not going to want to be caught out on it. So I think they are going to have to divulge that information. But there are then going to be questions about why this information has not been brought to light before.
Beyond the documents, and we've talked a lot about the Epstein files and we'll come back to them separately, we've also seen a new significant allegation emerge against Andrew, and it prompts the question whether or not it has come to light working in conjunction with the Epstein files, and whether or not the victim has come forward because she feels more emboldened. But we saw on Saturday night a second woman alleged that Jeffrey Epstein sent her to the UK to have a sexual encounter with Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor. She claims it was at Royal Lodge in 2010 when she was in her 20s. And this is according to Brad Edwards of the American law firm Edwards Henderson, same attorney who represented Virginia Giuffre. Now, the BBC has said of this report, which is the first time an Epstein survivor has alleged a sexual encounter at a royal residence, the BBC has said it can't corroborate that against palace records without identifying her. Andrew and Brad Edwards were both asked for comment from the Sunday Times and haven't responded. We have still not heard any response to the BBC's report from Andrew on that. Was there any discussion or comment sort of when you were travelling with the Prime Minister or with your colleagues about that report?
No, I mean, you have to understand, when we're travelling with him, we're in very different time zones from everybody else. So, I mean, effectively, we, although we did have access to Wi-Fi, we were speaking to the Prime Minister very, very early in the morning on Saturday morning, UK time anyway. So a lot of this had yet to emerge. I think as we were talking to him, all that had emerged at that point was some of the description of some of the files. I think some of the stories about the procuring of Russian women and the fact that these files had been released. In fact, the more sort of lurid details, or the beginnings of those lurid details, didn't emerge until well after we had landed back in Heathrow.
Is there a feeling that there's also a national security risk here? Because do you remember about, a year and a half, Christmas before last, we had all the stories around Andrew's links to Yang Tenbo, the alleged Chinese spy who the government are absolutely adamant is a spy, and he says he isn't, had formed a very close professional relationship and business relationship with Andrew. There were stories and reports around suggestions the government and the security services became increasingly concerned about that. There's a suggestion of, more Russian links with Epstein. Is there a sort of concern from the government and Parliament about a ongoing national security risk that Andrew may have sort of caused?
I wouldn't be at all surprised if there was. I think at the moment they're dealing with the crisis at hand, which is the information which is coming out. But obviously, I think things will turn in that direction ultimately, because, if this information is out there, there's a lot of compromat, obviously, that's been available to the highest bidder for a long period of time. This is how hostile states behave when they have this kind of compromat. There's obviously a lot of compromat out there. So I think it is going to be of concern. But also, if this individual has infiltrated, as we were saying, not only the royal family, but also senior members of the government. This individual was implicated in all sorts of things that we don't yet fully understand. And so I'm sure there will be questions that are asked about security. But at the moment, the government, a bit like the royal family, is just engulfed in the crisis that it has at hand at the moment. And I think, for it, what it needs to focus on at the moment is answering those questions about judgment of the Prime Minister, because once again, there are fears that this could start rocking the boat quite significantly. And if not for the Prime Minister himself, there are certainly a lot of questions being asked about his Chief of Staff once again.
So Epstein has managed to lose a prince's title because he was associated with Epstein. We've lost a peer. We could lose a prime minister from what you're saying.
Well, there are certainly people that are pointing in that direction just because there is such anger. This isn't an isolated incident. The question of judgment of the Prime Minister has come up repeatedly, time and time again, that he's often acted too slowly, that he's been too trusting, he's been too economical with the truth, either because he didn't know enough about it and didn't ask the right questions, or because he's actually obfuscating. And I think that is a problem for him.
So I think this is a ripple effect, isn't it, of these files and Epstein now, dead.
So we've got political pressure building that you're talking about, huge political pressure building on Sir Keir Starmer, I think, and, that appointment around Mandelson, and I'm sure more will come out about that. We've got the walls literally and physically closing in on Andrew.
And a potential police investigation if Metropolitan Police want to open any investigation.
And I imagine there'll be huge pressure on the police to do so, whether or not it goes anywhere. I think that, because the public are looking at this, because of the nature of those emails, which clearly include what we would call market-moving or market-sensitive information, there is going to be pressure on them.
I have to say, what I have been astonished by in the last few days, and perhaps I shouldn't be, but I have been, because each time something else comes out about Andrew, you think maybe just this time he'll show a little bit of common sense. I have been astonished to see him daily out riding in Windsor Great Park,
waving from the car yesterday to people at Windsor.
Specifically riding past where the photographers are, where he knows the photographers and the camera crews are, as if he hasn't got a care in the world. You would think he would just keep his head down, but no, on he ploughs, as if he hasn't got a care in the world.
Well, he's not one for a low profile, is he? Although he had, whether he'll say something, I don't know.
You see it even with Lord Mandelson. I mean, the interview that he gave to Katie Balls, which appeared in the Times today, which basically suggests that he thinks there's going to be another reset, that there's another opportunity, that he's going to now become from the insider to the outsider, effectively.
He's Mr. Teflon, isn't he?
Mr. Teflon, and that he's going to have some future role advising the Labour government, but not inside it, but outside it. I mean, I
feel like he's risen from the ashes one too many times.
Yeah,
it can't
and he
surely
has. But I think
again.
just the psychology is fascinating of both of them, and I think also just this notion, certainly that we're hearing from Peter Mandelson, is that he feels that he's as much a victim as anybody else. That's implicit from everything that he said, that he feels that he was manipulated and used by Jeffrey Epstein, and that he's one of the victims. And if that's the mentality, I think it's really difficult for him to sort of move on and appreciate perhaps the difficulty that he now finds himself in.
You do wonder what the kind of other victims. I suppose obviously our thoughts remain with the women who were trafficked by Epstein. But of course, there are other people who've been embroiled in this innocently. We talked about Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie. We do wonder what role there'll be for them going forward.
It opens up the whole question of how the family will continue to respond to this, because Beatrice and Eugenie, there have been reports, unconfirmed reports, that Eugenie has, not really spoken to her father very much in the last few weeks. We saw Beatrice, though, out riding in Windsor Great Park with one of her children, out riding with Andrew. So they're still in touch. This sort of idea that I think the royal family continue to be braced for more and more coming out on a daily basis. The suggestion from Congress is that was the final release of files.
But we wonder whether perhaps there might be more.
There are other means and ways of getting hold of those files, aren't there? Because we saw so many of them come out and reported release before Congress actually released them. So I think it would be naive for anyone to think that will be the last document dump. But the implications for the royal family are just ongoing, because the palace doesn't know what's coming from one day to the next. The members of the royal family, we saw just on an engagement a couple of weeks ago where Kate was, William and Catherine being heckled on an engagement about Andrew. How long have you known about all of this? This is,
have you been covering up for Andrew?
The next time a member of the royal family is out on manoeuvres, which is soon, we're about to go to Saudi Arabia with William, it's very evocative of a few months ago. We went to Brazil and Andrew, his uncle, had just been, de-princed, and the scandal was sort of all over the beginning of that trip. William managed to sort of navigate it. We're about to go to Saudi Arabia on a really important, trade mission, effectively. William's going to be out in Saudi Arabia holding trade talks with the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. We expect to see him there on all sorts of things. And a lot of us are going to be talking about, and the wider world, is the ongoing fallout for the royal family of the Epstein files.
I was going to ask you, you wrote at the weekend about it being kind of an indelible stain on the monarchy. Do you think they'll ever get over this? Do you think that
No.
it's so now ingrained through them that it's sort of rotten to the core?
I don't think the monarchy is rotten to the core. I do think
people will think that. Is that what you mean?
I do think that when I wrote about sort of, that the king can remove all the titles, remove the dukedom, remove, the prince title, but he can't scrub out the stain left by Andrew. And, a lot of people will say, well, it's not the king, the king's done all he can. It harks back to what Queen Elizabeth perhaps didn't do. But I just feel, maybe not through any fault of their own, possibly through just acting a little bit too slow, that this has reached such epic proportions that no one will be able to look and, consider King Charles's reign, or indeed even Queen Elizabeth's reign, without factoring in what was going on behind the scenes with Andrew on official manoeuvres and now even outside of the family. But still, the reputational damage to the institution this is causing will be permanent.
Well, I think the problem is it could also do the same for the government. And I think one of the interesting things is now we're seeing them try to move quickly to do all sorts of things. But the story is going to keep moving. And my fear...
It's moving quickly.
It's moving really quickly. And my fear is for Sir Keir Starmer that they're going to do all the things that they can do, pull the levers now.
Like the king did.
But actually the story is just going to keep moving. And then they're going to have nowhere to go. So there's no other formal way that they can cauterise it.
As it has done for the king.
Exactly.
He's pulled all the levers. Palace say he's done everything he can.
Yeah.
The story is still
keeps
getting worse and worse.
Unlike the government, though, Andrew's going to remain the king's brother, whether he likes it or not. As I said before, he can't
be
kind
voted
of
out of the family.
He can't be voted out of the family. He can't be sacked from the family, and he can't have the Windsor DNA extracted from him in a way that perhaps government can. Well, will you come back and talk to us as things develop? Because it would be really good so it feels like there's, watch this space.
I don't think we'll be writing about much else for this weekend.
No.
Well, thank you very much, Caroline Wheeler, for joining us this week.
And for more analysis from Caroline, check out her podcast, The State of It, and it's a very good listen.
And as we said, we're going to be watching as the fallout of the Epstein files rolls on. So make sure you follow us wherever you are, and please don't miss any of the news.
And a reminder, you can watch as well as listen to the podcast on our new YouTube channel.
You can just search Times Royals on YouTube for full episodes of the podcast, plus any breaking royal news and analysis from across the Times.
That's it from us this week. Thanks for joining us on The Royals, and we'll see you next time, where we'll be reporting, like we said, from Prince William's trip to Saudi Arabia.